El segundo día de la jornada de Otra Economía está en marcha. Muchas gracias, Julia, también por aceptar estar con nosotras. Es un placer contar contigo. Perdona estos problemas técnicos, pero bueno, las tecnologías al final tienen a veces estas consecuencias. La verdad es que es un placer para nosotros contar contigo. Julia Steinberger es investigadora y profesora de Economía Ecológica en la Universidad de Lausanne, Suiza. Su investigación examina las conexiones entre el uso de recursos y los resultados sociales, analizando los vínculos actuales e históricos e identificando vías alternativas para orientar la necesaria transición hacia una sociedad dentro de los límites planetarios. Además, es autora principal del sexto informe de evaluación del IPCC en el grupo de trabajo 3 de vías de mitigación compatibles con los objetivos a largo plazo y también participó en la conferencia Más allá del crecimiento que hubo en el Parlamento Europeo en el año 2023. Así que pues yo creo que es un placer contar con ella aquí con nosotras en la sesión de Otra Economía está en marcha, que por cierto, la vamos a grabar para que luego quien no esté aquí con nosotras la pueda ver y ya pues te dejamos a ti el turno de palabra, Julia. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for coming on a Saturday morning when to talk about alternative economics. And I'm apologizing for not being with you in person and also for not speaking in Spanish. I can understand it, but speaking in a seminar would not be possible. I will start sharing screen and I will try to speak. I know often I speak too fast. I will try to speak a bit slower so that the translators can manage. I think you're hearing a translation right now in the room. So thanks to the translators. Okay, so the title for today is An Economy for Living Well Within Planetary Boundaries and Some Challenges.
Recording in progress.
And so I think that one of the things is that living well within planetary boundaries is a utopia. But one of the things we are not doing right now is living in a utopia. We are definitely heading for very bad times. So these are just a couple of points from the IPCC report on 1.5 degrees that came out already 7 years ago in 2018. And basically what it shows is in the first graph, you have the temperature range of the Holocene. So you basically, on this plot, you see that the temperature 0 is the temperature that the Earth was at for the past 10 to 12,000 years during the Holocene. And you can see the Holocene temperature range, which is this pink temperature range, which is very narrow. And what you can see, and it's during this Holocene that humanity developed things like agriculture or writing or cities. So what we call civilization, basically. And you can see that we're shooting out of the Holocene very fast because of climate change. So we probably left the Holocene in terms of the temperature range sometime around maybe 2015, so only about 10 years ago. And we're really shooting out of it extremely fast. We've already passed 1.5 degrees last year. Was the first year recorded with a global average above 1.5 degrees. And this means that, you know, the years we are living now are very important and very dangerous, and we really have to try to act and do everything we can. And this talk will be some of my ideas about that. What this looks like in terms of the climate change we're already seeing, this is Greece in 2023, in September. There was a major flood. What you're seeing, the land that is covered with water should not be covered by water. And this is the agricultural center of Greece. And that land will never be the same and it will never be as productive. So not only were the crops lost in that year, but that land is forever changed. However, because Greece has an economy, an economy with warning systems and so on, I don't think anybody died in this major flood. However, this is not the same weather event, the same huge dumping of rain had a very different effect across the Mediterranean in Libya. So this was the same weather event, this huge amount of downpouring of water, and it's probably to this day the single most deadly climate event, because overnight this dam burst and destroyed the city of Derna in Libya. And what you see is the remains after the flood, with pretty much a great part of the city being destroyed, and something between 10 and 20,000 people died overnight, just were swept out to sea. This was a catastrophe that people knew was going to happen because the dam was unsafe, and people had been publishing, so researchers had been publishing articles and trying to warn people, but because of a bad governance system, because the Libyan government wasn't taking care of this dam, nothing happened, and this disaster instead was very, very destructive, including killing a poet who, there was a very famous Libyan poet who lived in the city who had a poem about the flood, and he died that night. So this is sort of the world we're living in is very anti-utopian, and of course with Trump things are getting worse. So this is more recently what Los Angeles looked like in January, with huge fires. And one of the places that this fire, really, really devastating fires, destroying entire neighborhoods. And one of the places this fire destroyed was the cemetery in Altadena, where, which is a neighborhood of Los Angeles, where Octavia Butler is buried. And this touched me a lot because I'm a big fan of Octavia Butler. So if you don't know who Octavia Butler is, I recommend that you start reading her. And in particular, her most famous book, The Parable of the Sower, which is a novel about climate catastrophe. It's a science fiction book that is just really amazing. And she talks about change in this book. So all that you touch, you change. All that you change changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change, which is also written on her gravestone. And I think that we really need to learn from these cultural stories, and yes, we need to learn from people like Octavia Butler, who were thinking about climate disaster. And she also had in the book following The Parable of the Sower, she basically predicted Trump. And so this is all very important for us to take seriously. So I will start talking now about the utopian research that we do, and some basic results from the different research projects I've done over the past few years. And I hope that the way I'm talking is okay for the translators. Okay. So we will start just with some basic facts about energy and well-being. So in order to live well within limits, we need to have enough resources, but not too much. And we need to understand how much energy is necessary for well-being. And the first stylized fact, the first basic fact, I call the high plateau. And basically, beyond a certain level, energy increases do not contribute to well-being. So after a certain point, you don't need more. And we have known this an incredibly long time. The paper I'm citing here is from 1974. So it's over 50 years ago that this paper was published by Alan Mazur and Eugene Rosa, saying massive energy consumption is not necessary to maintain living standards in America. And it was true then, and it's even more true now. And what the high plateau looks like is basically this kind of graph, where on the vertical axis you have a well-being indicator, like the Human Development Index, and on the horizontal axis you have an energy indicator, energy per capita, in this case electricity use, but it doesn't matter which indicators you put because the graph always looks the same. You have a very steep rise at low energy use levels. Any little extra bit will matter a lot in terms of increases in well-being. And then past a certain point, it just doesn't matter anymore. So here you can see that past 4,000 kilowatt hours per hour per capita, all the countries are at high well-being, and using more energy does not help. So that's the first basic fact. The second stylized fact, the second basic fact, is something I call dynamic decline. It means that the energy that is necessary for well-being doesn't stay the same over time. And in fact, it drops dramatically over time. So the energy required for any level of well-being is a dropping function of time. It's decreasing. And this is something we showed in 2010, already 15 years ago, that what the graph is showing is energy use per capita on the vertical axis versus time. And the green curves are showing how much energy is necessary for a certain level of well-being internationally. And you can see that these functions are dropping dramatically over time. And one of the things that's really interesting here is that in the 1970s, on the planet Earth, there was not enough energy being consumed for universal high well-being. And this changed around 1990, or in the 1990s. All of a sudden, we start having enough and even a lot more energy use than necessary for universal well-being. And the reason for that is not because we're using more energy, it's because the energy necessary for well-being is dropping really fast. Okay. Now, if we want to go beyond these basic facts, we need a framework to analyze what's happening inside. So we can't just look at the economy as something where you have energy coming in and well-being coming out, and you don't care about what's happening inside. You actually have to care what's happening inside the economy. And this is what we do with this framework in the Living Well Within Limits project, is we basically have a framework where we look at biophysical inputs, which is what you see on the left-hand side. And so those would include things like natural resources and energy. And then we look at social outcomes and well-being on the right-hand side. And in the middle, what we do is we basically describe the economy and society through this concept of provisioning systems. And provisioning systems have both physical and social aspects. And we'll get back to that a bit later. So the first thing I'm going to do is talk a bit about well-being, how we think about it and how we measure it, and because I think that that's always important. So the first people who thought about well-being were in ancient Greece. The first sort of writings we have, but they weren't the first people to think about it for sure, but they're some of the first writings that we have on this specific topic. And so, we're going to start here with Aristotle. So Aristotle said that well-being, it means to be able to live a life as fully as possible and flourish within society. So this is a really interesting conception because it's really about human potential. It's about flourishing, and it's about society. It means that it's not an individual perspective. There is no such thing as well-being outside of one's society. However, a few decades later, Epicure comes along, and his perspective on well-being is very different. He says well-being is basically much more emotional. It's much more personal. And so there's this idea of achieving a balance of positive, more positive feelings and less negative feelings. And Epicure's view on well-being is sort of the one that we probably recognize more today in our societies. And what's interesting is that these two perspectives continue to this day. So to this day, you have to sort of choose if you're talking about well-being from Epicure's perspective or well-being from Aristotle's perspective. And if you're on Team Epicure, then, and this is not, I really have to say, this is a very simplified version, and this is not what Epicure would agree with, okay? He would not agree with what his ideas turned into, but it's true that his ideas were to some extent at the root of what this then became to our days. So the perspective of Team Epicure on well-being is going to be something like happiness. It's emotional, it's individual. You measure it with a single indicator, like the happiness indicator or the utility indicator. And the view of this view of well-being on the economy is that more growth means more income, means more consumption, means more positive feelings. So economic growth is good because you will end up feeling better if you consume more stuff on average. If you're on Team Aristotle, your view is very different. So your perspective is going to be one of flourishing instead. So it's an active perspective rather than an emotional perspective. Its well-being is social rather than individual. You measure it with multi-dimensional indicators. You're not just going to have one indicator, but you're going to have multiple dimensions, like the multiple dimensions in the Human Development Index or in the Sustainable Development Goals. These are all multiple dimensional frameworks. And your view of the economy is that economic development is only justified if it supports human potential. So the only way that you really can justify an economic direction is if it's helping people flourish in their society. Growth for its own purpose is not interesting. And as you can probably tell, within our research project, we definitely focus more on the Aristotle side of things. And we wrote some papers about this. Okay. So one of the things is that theory is nice, but facts are more important. So we tried to understand if we could test Aristotle's theory. And to test Aristotle's theory, we basically use a modern version of it, which is developed by Doyle and Guff in The Theory of Human Need, a book published in 1991. So we're using this perspective of human need satisfaction. You have many different dimensions of human needs that will then result in well-being. And so we want to test if this is true. If human needs are satisfied, are people okay? And we do this with international data first. So this is an article that was published in 2018 in Nature Sustainability. We checked for this. So we looked at international data. We looked at needs being satisfied or not. And then we said, if needs are satisfied, does that have an effect on average life satisfaction, which is an indicator of, subjective well-being that fits with Epicure. So, and what we see is we see a very strong relationship. We did not expect anything this strong to come out of it. We also looked at a well-being indicator of physical health, and here the relationship is even stronger because you actually see some saturation in there. A more recent result, which you can find on the internet on the preprint server, is an article by Leah Tamberg, which was submitted at the end of last year. So this is a first result from the REAL project. And what we see here is that if we try to understand from an international perspective using the Gallup World Poll data, which is huge amounts of data points, what we can see is that human well-being decouples from income if we take need satisfaction into account. So I'll just try to summarize the result here, but the blue curve is just well-being. So here measured as life evaluation versus GDP per capita. And you can see that the blue curve really, has there's a strong effect of income, but the orange and red ones are taking need satisfaction into account. And not only do they move up, which means that if your needs are satisfied, your well-being level is higher than you would expect just with income, but they also flatten by the time you have the red curve where you take into account individual and social need satisfaction. You really don't see an effect of GDP growth at all. And so for us, this is proof that Aristotle was right and that mainstream economists who took Epicure's perspective that economic growth is necessary for well-being are in fact completely wrong. And I think this is really very convincing proof. Okay, so now once we agree that well-being is something that we can think about and measure, we can try to do is check, does well-being exist within planetary boundaries in any country in the world? And we did this, and other colleagues have kept doing this, trying to test Kate Raworth's donut economics framework. So in Kate Raworth's donut economics, we have the planetary boundaries on the outside of the donut, and we don't want to go outside the donut because then we're crashing into the planet and destroying our life support systems. And we don't want to be inside the donut because inside the donut is the social foundation. And if we're inside the donut, it means we're socially deprived. So we want to be in the middle, which is inside planetary boundaries and having achieved good social levels. That's what we want. We want both things. And what it turns out is that no, absolutely not. There is no country. So this is a result from Andrew Fanning and colleagues in 2021. And what we see is environmental. So the planetary boundaries are sort of along the horizontal axis, and the social level is on the vertical axis. And we can see that where we would be if we were inside the donut is where the donut is shown on the plot. And that is a place that is very far from every country. And not only that, but things are generally getting worse. Okay, so that's the bad news. Okay, so what does this mean? Where do we go from here? Well, so I'm going to try to give the talk in 3 facts and 3 ways forward. So the first fact is inequality, and I would argue that the way forward from inequality is sufficiency. The second fact is possibility, what we can really do. We know we can do, and the way forward there is investment. And the third fact is dependency, and I would argue that the way forward there is economic democracy. And we'll start with those. Okay, so the first fact is inequality. So in this plot, what you see is from the United Nations Environmental Program Emissions Gap Report from 2020. And it shows the inequality in CO2 emissions. So the inequality in the causes of climate change between rich people and poor people. And I'm just going to focus on the pie bit of it. What you can see there is that the top 1%, the top richest people, no matter where they live in the world, the top 1% of income earners are responsible for 15% of global emissions. And the top 10%, which includes the top 1%, are responsible for 48% of global emissions, which is basically half. So 10% of money, well, the 10% richest people is 50% of emissions. And the poorest half of the world, so the poorest 50% of all income earners, are only responsible for 7% of emissions. So they're responsible for half of what the 1% emits. And so we see this huge inequality, which really mirrors economic inequality. So we know that inequality is playing a huge, huge problem here. And that we really need to think about this. So here, I think I will not talk about this because I can show it in a different plot, and I think it would take too long to explain. But basically, we have a lot of data that shows that, in fact, inequality in energy use and inequality in emissions is really driven by transportation. So I'm just showing you this result because I think it shows it quite clearly, but it's for one country. It shows it for the United Kingdom, but it's something that we really see worldwide. We have worldwide data showing this. So what this figure shows, what this slide shows, is that the top 10% in energy. So basically, from the numbers from 1 to 10 are the different deciles of income. So the top 10 is the top 10% richest people in the UK, and the bottom 1 is the bottom 10% people in the UK. And what you can see is their energy footprints coming from different causes. And you can see that housing is fairly equal. It's really incredibly equal. The energy used in housing really changes very little across the different income deciles. Now, the UK is a bit strange. Normally, you would see it changing a bit more. But this is something we see worldwide, is that housing energy use is much more equally distributed than transportation. Where you see the inequality really sort of exploding is in these transportation categories. Flights and car use are massive, right? So the flights are in red and car use is in sort of pink. And you can really see the inequality exploding in these categories. And in the UK, the inequality is so huge in flying, for instance, that the richest 10% use more energy in flying than the poorest 20% use total. And I bet that in Spain and in other European countries, this is not so different. So we really see huge inequality, and that inequality is mainly in transportation. And I also want to show you one other thing we did. I'm sorry, this is a bit in the disorder, but we were able to show that a more equal world would actually be easier to decarbonize. And this is work from Yannick Oswald in 2021, and you can look it up. But basically, if you look at the energy profile of the low consumer in terms of their total energy use, the low consumer uses much more orange, this orange category, which is heat and electricity, which is really housing. So there is much more energy used in housing when you're poorer than when you're a mega consumer. So the mega consumer has obviously they're going to be using much more energy. Even their orange part is going to be bigger, but they're using much more of their energy in transportation in this pink part. And so basically, if you're making the world more equal, if you just took the amount of money around the world and redistributed it equally, you would basically have roughly the same amount of energy use than when you started, but making it more equal means that more people would be using energy use in buildings, because that's what people really need to be well. And they would be using much less of it in transportation. And since buildings and electricity and heat are much easier to decarbonize, that means that an equal world is more easy to decarbonize. So that's maybe some good news. In terms of how we deal with inequality, what we need to do is we need to move towards sufficiency. And here I have a picture of what that looks like in Geneva, which is actually this really nice neighborhood. The picture does not show really how amazing it is. It's beautiful and really a fun and lovely place to be. So sufficiency is a set of measures and daily practices that avoid demand for energy, materials, land, and water, while delivering human well-being for all within planetary boundaries. This is a definition given by Yamina Saheb, and that means that we all use privately as much as we need to be okay, but we also can have much more public investment. And so, and public infrastructure and public resources, as in this neighborhood where they basically have a lot of really nice things that they share in order to be well. Okay, so the second fact after inequality is possibility. So in order to check possibility, we did a modeling exercise. Can we model a future world where everybody is using really efficient technologies and in a much more equal way, has all their needs satisfied, and we're going to try to look at each case at the most efficient high-performance technology. So in each case, we're going to look at really high-performance technology that's possible, existing technology, but really high performance to see how much we can do at how low energy. So we did this based on the Decent Living Energy Framework of Narasimha Rao of Yale University. We're connecting human needs to sufficient levels of energy services using this framework. And our model is global, so it's for all countries in the world. I'm not going to go into details in the model. We don't have enough time for that today, but basically we take human needs. We basically look at the technologies necessary for the different needs to be realized. And we look all the way upstream into private, retail, what's necessary in the house, what's necessary outside the house, the infrastructure, the public infrastructures like schools and hospitals, and all of these things. We have both direct energy use and indirect energy use, so embodied in the products. This is not a low-tech future. It is reasonably high-tech. Everybody has washing machines, everybody has dryers, everybody has sufficient hot water, heating, cooling, All of these things are there. Everybody has a phone, everybody has a computer, and everybody has access to education and healthcare. Okay, so, and these are sort of the numbers. We can look at them later if you want, but of what we're delivering to people. And I'll just tell you what the result is. So in terms of possibility, everybody in the world would be able, in theory, to have high well-being, so decent living standards, at 40% of our current energy use. So this is what this plot is showing. The decent living energy paper that we did of Millward Hopkins is all of a sudden you get down to 150 or 160 exajoules of global energy final demand. So 160 exajoules for the whole world to live well, as opposed to where we are now, which is at 400 and something exajoules, heading for 500 by the end of the decade. And, you know, just we're going to keep going up. And this includes population growth. So this includes population growth. Despite population growth, we could actually reduce our energy use and deliver decent living standards to everybody. So this is based on efficient but realizable technologies, equitably shared infrastructure, and the need satisfaction depends on demography, climate, and geography. So we're sort of adapted to the local conditions. And so I think that this is a really great piece of news. It means that these things are possible. What is necessary to get them is the second way forward, and that's investment. And this is a result not from my research, not from my team. It's from Jarmo Kikstra and his colleagues, also including Narasimha Rao. And what they show is that they're basically showing what investment is necessary for decent living standards for everybody. And the global investment would be on the order of 290 exajoules. And you can see that most of that investment, so this is in energy terms, most of that investment would have to be in the housing, in the shelter sector. So buildings, appliances within buildings. These are the main areas of investment, especially because a lot of people around the world don't have, you know, safe housing, well insulated, whether you're in a cold or a hot climate. So we really need a lot of investment in the housing domain for people to really improve people's lives. And you see that you have some investment in mobility. The next biggest sector is in mobility, which is a lot of public transportation investment. If you look at the annual energy use after investment, which is the plot on the right, you can see that the shelter is tiny. So you're investing all this energy into housing, but then once you have all this good infrastructure, well insulated and so on, you use very little energy in it. So this is one of the big challenges of our time is, do we get to make this investment? Can we make this investment in our infrastructure to allow people to live well without using energy? And that's really one of the core challenges. And you can see that mobility is still, it becomes really the largest type of energy, even in a sufficiency world, a global sufficiency world. Mobility, transportation still takes a lot of energy. And that's just because of the laws of physics. If you move something from one place to another, you need energy. There is no choice there. But it's still much lower than if we continue things right now. So now I'm going to move to the third fact. So dependency, what is it made of? And here what we're looking at is what factors make life easier or harder for societies to achieve well-being at low energy use. So we're really looking in reality. We have a country. Is it doing well? Is it doing not well? What allows some countries to do better than others in terms of satisfying well-being at low energy use? And here, what we have to understand is that we really identify provisioning systems as the real place of interaction between planetary boundaries and well-being. So we really have resource use that is reaching planetary boundaries, including climate change, mediated through provisioning systems that are social, political, technical, and economic. and well-being, where we basically are trying to have our needs satisfied, to have good living conditions and autonomy. Okay, so the third fact that we realize here is dependency. So provisioning systems, in fact, could allow us to live at low resource use, to live really well at low resource use. But instead of allowing us to do that, in reality, they are often engineered to create resource dependency. And this is something that we really need to understand. There is a possibility of us living very differently, but right now, the way that the economy is working, the way that power and inequality are working, creates dependency on high resource use. And the way I try to explain it here, and we really see it with cars, we really see it with transportation, which is why I chose this picture, is that dependency on resource-intensive consumption is of itself an industrial product. So the industrial product is not necessarily the car, it's the fact that we can't live without a car. So they create dependency on their products, and then they will also sell us the product. And this is the way this is made. It's by decades, and in some cases, a century of lobbying, subsidies, and basically interfering with the ways our government work, which is what we call state regulatory capture. So our states are captured by these industries and basically prevented from developing infrastructures or alternative ways of living that would allow us to live well within limits. So this problem of dependency is really a creation of industry. And this is one of the things we studied in the article Mattioli et al. In 2020, where we looked at a political economy of car dependency. And we really were able to show this history of car dependency being imposed on modern industrial economies. And this is still ongoing. And how does this happen? So this is, I hope you appreciate this slide. It is the extent of my artistic capacities. So I hope you enjoy it. It's a cartoon version of the economy as a market. So this is sort of the mainstream economics view. You have a bunch of producers. They're the little ants with buckets, and they are throwing their products into the sea of the market. The market is the flat surface of the sea. Everybody is equal with respect to the market. And the consumers here have little beer steins. They're the ants with the little beer cups, glasses, and they're happy. They get to choose which kind of beer they want to drink from the market. Everybody is happy. All the ants are smiling. And no ant has any power over the market. No ant has any power over the sea. The sea stays this flat thing. Okay. Now, that's a nice idealized version of the economy, but the reality is very different. So this is, again, a cartoon version of what the real economy looks like. So what we have is we have vertical supply chains that are connected through technology clusters. And here the technology cluster I'm showing is the one of carbon intensive transportation. So you have oil is one cluster, is one vertical supply chain, roads and car infrastructure, cars themselves, suburban real estate, the idea that everybody lives in tiny isolated houses. And then the role of the state is you have state capture. So the state here is just a scaffolding. It is just helping hold the whole thing together. And the market is really a funnel. So the market is really something where the consumers then have no choice. They end up having to live their lives in cars, as we see Americans and more Europeans doing. So that's much more what the real economy looks like in my view. And in order to look at this more closely from a research perspective, we looked at, for instance, the privatization of public services. And we did this using a systems of provision approach. And we looked at the role of different actors, so providers, the people and investors, the people doing the privatization. We looked at the state, and we looked at consumers. We looked at the sort of turquoise blue layer is what is being said to justify the privatization. You know, we're going to have efficiency in the market. The consumers are homo economicus. The consumers will choose the best option for themselves through free choice. And the state will just oversee a beautiful competitive market. And the reality that we uncovered is the pink layer, is that we see that there's a lot of rent extraction, so profits, just sort of imposing profits from on the side of the providers. The state can't re-regulate because of strong lobbying, and we see cost increase on the consumer side. And so we really can see how the real economy is imposing negative conditions on the consumers, on the citizens. And we were able to share our findings with Phil Alston at the time when he was Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights for his UK visit. And this is what he stated in his report, based on our research, which is that abandoning people to the private market in relation to services that affect every dimension of their basic well-being without guaranteeing their access to minimum standards is incompatible with human rights requirements. And this, I think, is something that this research sort of on political economy and imposed dependency on certain types of production really, really shows. So what do we do with this? How do we move forward? I would argue we need to move forward in terms of democracy. So if we want to break the dependency and the capture of the state, we need to expand the scope of democracy and democratic decision-making into the economy. And we need active economic citizenship to become quite normal from the perspective of workers, community members, households, at every level of governance. And this is an example of the French Citizen Assembly, Les 150 on climate. We see, in fact, that democracy is a positive aspect. So if we look at what factors allow countries to achieve well-being at low energy use, we see that positive factors include public services, income equality, and democracy. None of this will be surprising based on what we've seen before in this talk. So public services and public infrastructures are crucial. Equality is crucial. Democracy is crucial. And we also all of, basically good infrastructure like electricity and sanitation. And we see negative factors are extractivism. Negative factors are economies being dependent on extraction like mining and fossil fuel industry, and also economic growth above a moderate income. And this study is not ideological, it is data-driven. We looked at all this data, we looked at which factors were positive or negative. So this is really what the reality is telling us in terms of where we need to go and where we need to move away from. We need to go towards democracy, equality, high levels of public services and good infrastructure, and we need to move away from extractivism, fossil fuel use, and in fact, economic growth above a moderate income. So this brings us to and now what? So for me, I'm working on, as part of the European ERC Synergy Grant, Real a Post-Growth Deal with my lovely colleagues, Yorgos Kallis and Jason Hickel, who are based in Spain, in Barcelona. And this is a project that is going to be going until 2029. We're going to be looking at a whole bunch of different things, but I'm very excited about, for instance, democratic provisioning. We're also looking at policies, at politics. We're looking a lot at labor and how much work is required to live well within planetary boundaries, and where should it be located, in what sectors, etc. We're going to be doing a lot of modeling. We're going to be looking a lot at North and South convergence and what post-growth economies would look like for Europe and for the global South. We've got some first results on some first ideas on democratizing provisioning systems. So this is one of the things that that we're looking at, is how we bring democracy into the economy. This is really important to us. And okay, so that's one direction is research. Another direction is rebellion. I think that we cannot live in a society where we just have science anymore. We need to also have activism. We also need to have active engagement, including of scientists. And I know that scientist rebellion in Spain is very strong. So this is just a collection of articles and thoughts about what we need to do. We have, I think that these topics have been discussed quite a bit, but I don't think that scientists can justify being separate from the popular movements that are trying to demand action. And we also have to be worried, obviously, very much today in terms of protest being criminalized around the world, people in jail, people for very long sentences, obviously in the US now being, disappeared like an authoritarian regime. So we have to worry about this criminalization and try to help people out and stop it. I also think we need to think more carefully and more strategically. So this is a point on strategy. We can discuss more. I will just say briefly that I've been worrying a lot about the history and the rise of neoliberalism. I wrote a blog about this question of what we are up against. And I think that this is something, if you're interested, you can read it. It's freely available. And I think there might be a Spanish translation. I think somebody might have written a Spanish translation. So if you're interested, you can learn more about this, the long history of how the fossil fuel industry has collaborated to has really acted very strongly to make sure that we have this unequal economy with a lot of disinformation, and are really attacking the role of the university. So I think that this is something that we need to take very, very seriously. Yeah. So in terms of science, yeah, I won't talk about this now, but I really think that the threat to science and where that threat comes from also comes from these industries and the long march of neoliberalism in that direction. So we need to watch out for that. And so that's it for me. I just wanted to say thanks so much for inviting me. Thanks to the translators. I hope it was okay. And I wanted to end with this note. So Octavia Butler was not born into a rich or successful family. She was a young Black woman who wanted to write best-selling stories. She wanted to write amazing science fiction. And so to inspire herself, she would write herself notes. And she, with these really colorful notes to sort of really tell herself, inspire herself to fulfill this mission. And this is one of her notes that I think is really amazing. And I think it should speak to us also as academics, as scientists, as students. So tell stories filled with facts. That's one of the things that scientists should do, is we should care about reality. So tell stories filled with facts. Make people touch and taste and know. And maybe we're not doing that enough. Our language is still quite complicated, but we really should try to make people care about this stuff, and then make people feel. So we should really engage not just, long, complicated scientific reports, but also emotions and also collaboration and collective action and organizing. All of these things need to come together at this point. It's not enough just to do science as usual. Thank you so much.
Can you hear me? Sí, muchas gracias, Julia. La verdad es que ha sido muy esclarecedora y muy interesante la presentación. Ahora tenemos un ratito de preguntas. Si queréis, hacemos como ayer, hacemos como tandas de 3 y así tampoco te abrumamos y vamos un poco controlando el tiempo. Así que levantad la mano, sí. Sí,
¿En español o en inglés?
Si lo dices en español, tiene ya también traducción en inglés, así que como...
Vale, pues ya está. Bueno, Julia, muchísimas gracias. Es un placer, de verdad, estar aquí y escucharte. Eres una referencia mundial en todo. Y bueno, yo vengo del background de IAMS y del modelado. Y mi pregunta es bastante simple y bueno, tenemos muchos modelos, algunos más liberales, otros más intervencionistas, post-keynesianos, de economía ecológica, distintos pathways, distintos escenarios de futuro, pero yo por lo menos veo que están todos dentro del marco del capitalismo, de la lógica capitalista. Y mi pregunta es directa. ¿Tú crees que es posible lograr cualquier uno de estos pathways o futuros posibles dentro de esta lógica capitalista?
Cogemos otras dos preguntas si queréis y luego...
Did I answer directly?
What do you prefer, Julia? Just, we take
It's
two or
your
three?
event. You choose.
Pues sí, yo creo que cogemos dos o tres. We take 2 or 3 questions.
Okay.
And then...
Cogemos 2 o 3.
Can you mute, Julia, yourself? Thank you.
Bueno, me ha gustado mucho, muchas gracias. Nada, bueno, para avanzar en un nuevo paradigma de crecimiento o de crecimiento, tú has hablado, no solamente aquí, sino en tu entrevista en El Salto y en otros medios, que se propone una visión para combatir el cambio climático como un proyecto humano, una cosa global. Es decir, esto es un problema, es un gran lío, pero que tenemos que verlo como un mal común. Y para ello se necesitan consensos. Pero en otras entrevistas has dicho que incluso los expertos en clima no tienen ese consenso en cuáles son las medidas de crecimiento verde, crecimiento ecológico. ¿Cómo alcanzar un nuevo paradigma de decrecimiento o de crecimiento si no tenemos esos consensos base que son los supuestos para empezar a trabajar conjuntamente?
¿Y otra más? ¿O no? No hay...
Buenos días, muchas gracias por la presentación, que ha sido muy interesante. A mí me gustaría preguntar por la democracia económica, dado que en las democracias actuales los discursos negacionistas del cambio climático o los discursos promovidos, por ejemplo, por grandes lobbies como el Atlas Network, están llegando dentro de los sistemas económicos, de sus procesos, los sistemas democráticos y de sus procesos de decisión y demás. En una democracia económica, ¿cómo se evitaría que esto sucediera? Porque el neoliberalismo es de por sí antidemocrático, pero utiliza la democracia para llevar a cabo sus planes antidemocráticos, ¿no? Es curioso. Entonces, ¿cómo se evitaría que utilizaran también la democracia económica? ¿Cómo se evitaría que la corrompieran? Igualmente.
Vale, pues...
Can I answer before I don't have a pen and paper here, so before I forget them, can I answer?
Okay, yeah, go for
I
it.
think
Yeah.
a fourth one would just empty my brain.
Okay, yeah, perfect. Go for it.
Okay, thanks. So the first question was on IAMs and scenarios and whether or not the current framework of IAMs, which are built, the models reflect a certain way of thinking about the economy, including capitalist functioning, and whether or not this is compatible. You can actually represent a post-growth future, for instance, or a degrowth future in those models. And I think the answer is yes and no. And if you're willing to send me, you can find my email address, the person who asked this question. I will be happy to send you a draft of an article that is now in revisions, where we basically go through what certain models have already tried to do in terms of degrowth or post-growth interventions and how far they got. And people are trying, which is really great. And I really want to appreciate that work. But what we're also saying in this article is that it's not, in fact, possible to represent an anti-capitalist or post-capitalist future in those models. And so we're also saying these are the ways that the models do not represent the kinds of the economic reality we see in a post-growth transition, including things like how do you reshape consumption and production? Not all production is equally valuable. So you have to be able to shape production and change sectors in order to help satisfy human needs and reduce inequality. Also, the representation of well-being can't be assumed to be GDP growth. We have, anyway, so because in the current models, GDP growth and well-being are assumed to be the same thing. In fact, well-being is not separately represented. So if we want to represent these things differently, we have to do different types of modeling. And we're trying to encourage people to try to develop these alternatives, and we're trying to develop them ourselves. What we have to understand is that our group is very small compared to the established groups, and what we can do is going to be limited, but at least we can show some proof of concept of other ways of doing things. So I hope that that answers your question, and I'm very happy to share this, confidentially, this preprint with you, which goes through these ideas more clearly. The second person who asked the question, oh my God, now I've forgotten it already. It was about degrowth and post-growth. So about the dominance of growth ideology in media and in science, and how scientists are not in agreement on this. And so how can we change the discourse in the public if the scientists are not in alignment? And I think from my perspective, it's not a problem to have some scientists who say, hey, let's check out if we can have green growth. I think they're wrong. I looked for green growth, 15 years ago and couldn't find it. And then I became a degrowther. So I think that the empirical evidence is on the side of degrowth, but I don't think it's a problem for scientists to look at growth possibilities. I think science should be open and free. The problem right now is that science is not open and free. It is very ideologically controlled, as we know, just based on the society around it. And I would say 90% of the research is on growth, and 10%, no, that's an exaggeration. It's 99% on growth and 1% on degrowth. And that's a problem. So there's a huge imbalance within science, I would say, even though more and more people are being convinced, especially natural scientists, that degrowth or post-growth might be the way to go, including within the IPCC, where now this is sort of an accepted thing, is that we need to reduce consumption volumes to act fast, even though it's been taking too long to get there. So I think within the scientific community, things are shifting because the evidence is so strong. But outside, in terms of the media, this is really hard. And when I will just tell you a story about this, I was there was a big conference called Beyond Growth in Brussels in 2023. Maybe some of you were there. And it was huge. There were thousands of people, mostly young people. It was great. And we had a press conference, and the press asked us questions. And what was so interesting about this was these were the journalists at the European Parliament in Brussels from major media outlets from around Europe. I forget if somebody was there from Spain, but quite possibly. And every single journalist in that room started their questions by saying the same thing. They said, I am here, my name is so-and-so, I come from this major news outlet in Europe, NZZ in Switzerland, whatever, Süddeutsche, Die Zeit in Germany, I don't know, whatever, the major news outlets. I am here for my personal interest because I need to tell you right away, there is no way in hell my editor will ever publish a story on degrowth. So they were just there to have fun because they cared. But they knew that their press outlets would not publish anything. And I think that this is a major problem, is that the media is so far behind the science that they don't even know how to communicate the reality. And I think that this is a huge problem that we need to work on. It was a bit shocking to see that the journalists wanted to talk about it and that they couldn't get it past the editors. That's I think, a big problem. The third question, if I can remember it properly, was about economic democracy and how neoliberalism messes with democracy. So neoliberalism is an anti-democratic project from the beginning, from the middle, from now, through all of their actions. They are against democracy, and they are very good at manipulating democracy. And what we are seeing happen in many countries, but especially in the US right now, is the victory of neoliberalism, right? They got the Heritage Foundation, one of the main think tanks of neoliberalism, put together Project 2025, which is what they wanted Trump to do when he got in office, and they are going through all of the things and doing them. So they won, and they are very anti-democratic, and they are good at manipulating democracy. So this is a problem. One of the reasons I really think that economic democracy can change things is the experience of being part of citizen assemblies and citizen juries, where people have a chance to talk to scientists and ask questions and work together. And these citizen assemblies were really well organized. They were representative of the population, so they were based on sortition, which means, you know, you get a letter in the mail, and then they made sure that they were socioeconomically representative, that they had climate deniers on them, that they had people who didn't care about climate at all. And those people were capable of thinking, asking questions, working together, coming up with ideas. They were really fantastic. So democracy and action on an everyday level works great and is very dangerous to industrial interests. Democracy that is representative, where people vote without necessarily being informed every few years, is much more dangerous and I think much more vulnerable. So I think the more people are actively engaged in their communities on an ongoing basis, the safer we are against this kind of manipulation. It is much harder to manipulate a group of people that has access to scientific experts and can ask them any question they want. So I think that process was quite robust, and it was amazing to see people who didn't believe climate change was real just be like, oh shit, this is real, let's work on it, you know? It was quite a transformative experience for everybody. So it really gave me a lot of faith in what people are able to do.
Vale, muchas gracias, Julia. Yo creo que podemos hacer otra ronda de un par o tres. Sí, sí, ¿no? Estamos pensando, estamos todas calladas.
Hi, Julia. Thank you so much. So I have two questions for you. One of them is the ban on petrol and diesel fueled cars in Europe by 2035, starting already in 2025, presents itself as an ecological solution, but in reality depends on the intensive and extensive extraction of resources. So how do we ensure that the transition doesn't reinforce the green capitalism? And the other is, how do we build a globally viable discourse on degrowth so that the costs aren't borne only by the non-Western countries or states, the non-Western states, or in a state only by the working class? ¿En español?
No, os las han traducido, no me parece, porque estaba escuchando. ¿Ya? Vale, ¿sigues? ¿Otras dos? ¿Hay más? Esperamos un... Mira, ahí sí que...
Vale, pues la digo en español porque como ya hay traducción.
Sí, sí.
Vale, pues mi pregunta es, bajo el marco de la Agenda 2030, si las ODS ahora mismo, bajo todo este panorama, ¿tienen algún sentido? ¿Aportan en algo a toda la cuestión que estamos tratando hoy? ¿O si es algo que hemos visto que no funciona y deberíamos girar políticamente hacia algún otro tipo de marco para acercar las acciones también? Bueno, no sé. Ya.
Sí. Está bien, sí.
I'm really sorry, I didn't understand ODS.
Sí.
Yeah, the international goals. Yeah. Sustainable Development Goals, that's it.
Ah, vale. ¿Y alguna más?
¿Puedo?
Sí. Dale.
Bueno, voy a hacer otra pregunta. Gracias. Un poco partiendo de lo que ha dicho la primera pregunta de nuestra compañera, que bueno, sabemos que la transición energética europea y estadounidense y China es muchísimo dañosa a los países del sur global, sí. Y mi pregunta va en el sentido del degrowth y el sur global, ¿no? No entiendo muy bien cómo se plantean los decrecentistas el degrowth en países que ni siquiera han crecido a niveles de bienestar básicos. Entonces, ¿sería llegar a un nivel básico y mantenerlo o no? No sé muy bien cómo el degrowth mira hacia el sur global.
Vale, pues con estas tres ya.
Okay. So thanks so much for those questions. And I think so to go to I'll just do an order. So in terms of the first one, and for instance, having electric vehicles instead of petrol and diesel vehicles, obviously this is the way forward. However, private cars are not the way forward. So electric transportation, yes, it's much better. It's much better in all different kinds of ways. The vehicles are more durable. You get less air pollution, so you get less dead people because globally, deaths from pollution, from direct pollution from emissions, not climate change, is around 8 million people per year, which is huge. And we get rid of that by at least half of that. We get are due mostly to transportation pollution. So electrification does a whole bunch of good things. However, it shouldn't be private cars. The private car is a solution for some people and for some uses, you know, if you're disabled, if you have a job where you need to get around and carry lots of stuff, although even for some of those jobs, people have electric cargo bikes, which work great. But, you know, there's some cases where an electric car is the right answer. But most of the cases, 90% of the cases, absolutely not. And public transportation that is electrified or micro-mobility that is electrified are the way forward. And they use far less resources in terms of lithium, in terms of other metals, than private cars. So I think the direction towards changing private cars from petrol and gas to private cars that are electrified is a disaster. And that is not a green solution. That is a stupid, wasteful, unequal, and exploitative solution. It's just a complete disaster. So yes, I agree that that's the wrong direction. In terms of the question of exploitation and the global south, and if the green transition is exploitative to the global south, right now everything is exploitative of the global south. One of the main things that we're doing within our new research project is looking at these questions of embodied labor, and there are more and more people also looking at socially, economically, and ecologically unequal exchange. So the long trajectory of extractivism of resources, money through debt, and labor from the global south to the global north, and what it would take to change that. So what a rebalanced world economy would look like. So this is something that Jason Hickel within the REAL project and his team are looking very, very strongly at. And we're doing some of that work in Lausanne as well. So there's already been a paper on the unequal exchange of labor. We're going to have much more detail on that. And also be able to, our goal is to have enough information to be able to model what a post-growth, much more rebalanced, much less unequal future looks like. And the policies for that fall under the perspective of delinking. So basically stop global north exploitation of global south and allow the south to produce for itself, to work for itself, to invest for itself, and to have trade relations on its own terms. So this is the whole agenda of delinking and degrowth and delinking. You know, degrowth, one of the ways we say it is it's degrowth in the global north and delinking in the global south. And this is what we're going to be contributing to a lot more. And I think that this is absolutely crucial And the amount of exploitation that we're uncovering is massive. And if things continue as they continue now without a challenge, that exploitation will continue as well. That's very clear. The second question was about the SDGs. Are the SDGs enough? Now, the Sustainable Development Goals. The funny thing about the SDGs is they're not even all bad. The one on work and economic growth is not great, but you could say, hey, we're not going to do bad growth. We're going to look at, economic security. But a lot of the things within the SDGs are really good in terms of focusing on health, focusing on sanitation, focusing on food. Like a lot of the dimensions are really great, and they allow us to point out problems, focusing on equality, on gender, all of these things is great. But they're also, I might think my main critique of the Sustainable Development Goals is it's a bit the same problem with human rights, is it's a list of nice things, but it doesn't tell us about the system of the obstacles we face. We face capitalism, we face multinational corporations that have taken over, legal and regulatory rights over all countries of the world through the WTO, through the World Trade Organization, through the tribunal process. The ISDS tribunal process is one of the main reasons we don't have national sovereignty in our economies, right? So the problem with the SDGs is they're nice, but they don't tell you how to get there because they don't tell you what you're facing, what you're up against in terms of the global system, the global economic and power system that prevents us from getting there. So that would be one of the critiques. And the third point was on, gosh darn it, I'm really sorry. It was on does degrowth mean for the global south? And I think I already covered that a little bit for the first question, but it's clear that many global south countries need growth. They need growth in the economy, they need growth in investment, they need growth in infrastructure development, they need growth in resource use. That's the case for a lot of countries. However, it's not just growth, because just growth benefits the richest and goes to the richest. And if you continue with existing inequality patterns, that growth is going to go to the richest and the poor stay poor. And it's going to take pretty much, hundreds of years or millennia for the poorest within those countries, or the poorest within all countries, to reach decent conditions. So the focus of degrowth in the global south is very much on equity. It's very much on providing, the economy should be providing the stuff that people need for their life and health and well-being and their life plans and conditions. So it's very much not just growth in general, it's targeted growth where it matters the most. And this goes with the delinking agenda, which means that the global south countries should be able to invest and produce and work on those things that matter the most to them for their own prosperity and escape the exploitation in terms of labor, in terms of resources, in terms of money that the global north is currently imposing on them. So there's two agendas. It's targeted growth based on the priorities of that place and the people who live there, especially the poorest, and it's autonomy in terms of them being able to do the work for themselves. Because right now what we're seeing is that the global north is extracting so much labor from the global south, just insane amounts, that they're not able to work for themselves and to build up their own, to build up their own economies and their own conditions. So that's one of the main things to change. So I hope that helps a bit. So I think there is a strong degrowth agenda for the global south, but part of it looks like growth. However, it's not indiscriminate growth, and it's not growth maintaining inequalities. That's for sure.
Vale, pues venga, dos últimas, porfi. Last two questions, Julia.
Hi, thank you, Julia, for your lecture. I wanted to, as you have just said, we need two agendas, one degrowth agenda in the global north and a delinking agenda in the global south. And as we know, they are highly and inherently linked between each other. How do we synchronize them? How do we make them work at the same time? Thank you.
Micro. Y hay otra. Tac. 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 Nada, tranqui.
Vale, yo quería preguntar, porque bueno, desde la academia llevamos prácticamente, bueno, lleváis más de prácticamente 100 años repensando el término de crecimiento y el desarrollo, creando índices como el índice de desarrollo que se creó ya, pues eso, casi 50 años, y surgen todos estos índices que quieren ser cada vez más inclusivos y tener en cuenta el bienestar, pero la realidad, o la sensación que yo tengo es que el sistema cada vez está más y más y más arraigado en la idea de medir todo esto simplemente con cuestiones meramente económicas. Entonces, me gusta que hables de rebelión, ¿no? De cómo cambiamos esto mediante rebelión, pero la realidad es cómo hacemos la rebelión para que esto cambie si la situación lleva siendo igual desde hace 100 años o desde que empezó la revolución industrial. Entonces, no sé, me gusta el concepto de rebelión, pero ¿qué hacemos? O sea, como personas individuales que no tenemos los recursos y no tenemos tampoco muchas veces ni el tiempo ni la capacidad económica, ¿cómo hacemos? Porque queremos un cambio, evidentemente yo entiendo que la gente que estamos aquí queremos un cambio, pero ¿qué hacemos?
Thanks so much. Those are two excellent questions. So I think that the modeling efforts we're going to be trying to do, even though they're quite basic, and hopefully the modeling that other people will be inspired to do. I mean, this area needs so much more, like there's so much more we can do with, you know, if people want to contribute, that would be great. Is that I think the modeling will help us sort of represent what a possible global trajectory could be, including delinking and degrowth at the same time, because basically we're going to have to be looking at production and consumption and inequality in different sectors and trying to sort of balance out who's working where, who's using what resources where, who's trying to invest in this infrastructure, and how do we sort of make sure that the whole thing is balanced, right? Now, that doesn't tell us how we do it, but it will give us some idea of what changes when. And one of the things we're talking about in terms of if we need delinking, then that means that the global north needs to be productive again, right? It means that, and I think that that's actually one of the agendas that's coming out in Europe as a result of Putin, as a result of Trump, is that we're at risk if we don't produce ourselves. And of course, right now it's in terms of weapons and armament, which is not great. But I think it's true more general. It's something that we can say this is true more generally. We need to be localizing our production of everything, because we shouldn't be exploiting other people to make it for us. It's geopolitically unsafe, and it's ethically and ecologically wrong. So I think that this idea of the policies that will allow the global, you know, that will ensure that the global south delinks also are policies that means that we have to do industrial policy in the global north, and we should be consuming less, but what we consume, we should be, to the extent possible, trying to make ourselves. It is not reasonable to expect other people to work in exploitative conditions to make stuff for us. We should be able to make our own things. So I think there's a relocalizing production and but that production, the priorities of that production have to be human needs and well-being, and not overconsumption, wastefulness, inequality, and so on. So those are the ways that we have to think about them consistently at some level. But I agree, it's a big challenge, and I think it's a really interesting topic to think through. How do we do these things together? The second question was, what do we do? Okay, rebellion is one thing to say, but it's how do we actually bring these ideas forward? And I'm actually rethinking my stance on rebellion. I think that civil disobedience is important. I do not think that getting arrested for the sake of getting arrested is a winning strategy in this context. So I've written more about this. If you look, there's a couple of blogs on Medium, the last couple of ones I wrote. I think that the left. And left is a word, the political left, I mean, is people who want more equality and social justice. And I assume that means most people in this room, that we have to rethink our tactics. We have to be much more focused on communication and communicating these ideas more broadly. We have to be focused on training people in what it means to start working in this area and organizing in this area. And we have to be focused on sort of creative actions that are not necessarily just civil disobedience for the purpose of creating disruption and getting arrested. Because I think Extinction Rebellion, Scientist Rebellion, a lot of people tried this. I think it brought some things forward, but I think it's also it's really, the cost is too high in terms of people's suffering, in terms of being jailed, and what's happening now. So I think we have to be more creative about this and think about new ways as well. So that's a longer discussion that hopefully more people will be having.
Pues muchas gracias, Julia, la que ha sido todo un placer y que nos has mostrado que sí que es verdad vivir dentro de los límites planetarios. Y bueno, con esto ya acabamos esta sesión. Ahora tenemos un pequeño descansito hasta las 12, que luego tendremos ahí la grabación del podcast con Rodrigo y con las compañeras de la Mundial. Así que pues nada, muchas gracias a todas y a ti en especial, Julia.
Thank you.
Thank you.